Welcome everybody to Naturalist Nights. Thank you so much for coming tonight. As many of you know, ACES recently suffered the loss of our education director, Aaron Trook, just earlier this week. So it's a very difficult time for us and for the whole community that he was involved in. And so it means so much to us that all of you are here tonight. It feels like support for ACES and support also for the work that Aaron cared so much about. If any of you have questions about that or would like to know more about how to support the family, you can find me or Jim or Phoebe after the talk, and we'll all be happy to answer questions and direct you to resources. So Naturalist Nights is a 10-week free speaker series in the Roaring Fork Valley, and it's hosted by a partnership between Wilderness Workshop, us, the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, and the Roaring Fork Audubon. If you have questions about the work that any of those organizations do, there's plenty of literature out front. Please feel free to check that out. And we host these talks from now through early March in Carbondale on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. and here at Hallam Lake in Aspen on Thursdays at 6 p.m. We're really grateful to, oh, my slides have advanced. We're grateful to our sponsors, to Woody Creek Distillery tonight, who is our featured sponsor. These businesses provide financial and in-kind donations, which cover travel expenses for our speakers and the cost of having Grassroots TV, thank you, Brad, in the back, video the presentations and making Naturalist Nights possible. Grassroots TV does air these presentations on Channel 12 Up Valley and Channel 82 Down Valley, and the videos are also available on our organization's websites and social media feeds in the coming weeks. We live stream each of the Naturalist Night speakers on either Wednesday or Thursday evening on both Wilderness Workshop and ACES Facebook pages. Thank you everybody who has signed in already. If you haven't done that, please find a moment to do it on your way out, or we'll pass the clipboard around. We're also very pleased to offer continuing education certificates. So if you're an educator, you can earn a free continuing education hour for tonight's presentation. You can get 1 hour per week, and there's no minimum necessary, and you can get up to 10 hours. So if you need to sign in for that, we also have a sign-up sheet out there. Please be sure to sign in. After the talk, all of you are invited to Aspen Tap for $15 pitchers. If you'd like to join us, please make sure just to get a stamp, and you'll be able to get discounted pitchers there. Just so you know, next week's presentation will be our own Rebecca Weiss and Mark Fuller with a talk about birding in the Roaring Fork Valley. They just finished a book, released it this summer, which focuses on birds in the Roaring Fork. They're really, really wonderful, great members of the community, so please come out to that. And now I'm really pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Van Graham. Where is Van?
He just stepped out to the restroom.
Okay, so we might be waiting for Van a little bit, but this way he won't know if I make any mistakes in his introduction. Van is a retired wildlife biologist who worked for Colorado Parks and Wildlife for 32 years. His interest in sandhill cranes began when working in Steamboat Springs, where the core population of Colorado's nesting and staging cranes is located. Sandhill cranes were listed as a Colorado endangered species in 1973, and by the mid-1970s, research on cranes had intensified, primarily to gather baseline data and begin development of management plans and programs. Throughout his career, Van has assisted with annual work plans, inventories, field studies, and the development of a Greater Sandhill Crane recovery program. He worked with CPW wildlife managers based in Northwest Colorado and collaborated on plans with the U.S. Forest Service. Van currently lives in Grand Junction, where he works as a private environmental consultant, mostly working in western Colorado. He's a board member of the Colorado Crane Conservation Coalition, which sponsors the annual Yampa Valley Crane Festival in Steamboat Springs in late August through early September each year. He maintains a deep interest in sandhill cranes and enjoys traveling to various locations to observe, photograph, and enjoy them across North America. It is such an honor to welcome Ray to our 2019 Naturalist Night series. Thank you so much. There you go.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're all mic'd up.
Yeah, I think I've got a microphone here. Hello. I'm glad you could all turn out tonight to talk about sandhill cranes or learn about sandhill cranes. Let me find my changer here.
It should be right on the podium there.
Oh,
Yep, there it is.
hidden there. I worked with sandhill cranes since 1976 when I was a district wildlife manager up in Steamboat Springs. In 1973, the sandhill cranes were listed as a state endangered species. It was about the same time the Federal Endangered Species Act was put into effect. There were river otters and some prairie chickens and some other wildlife species that were also added to the list at that time. But sandhill cranes, folks really didn't know too much about them. Their populations were pretty low. There was a small population up around Hayden and Steamboat Springs, but they thought that was a species that needed some work. And for the next 25 years or so, I worked with the cranes, developing recovery plans, doing annual inventory work and that sort of thing, working with the Forest Service and the BLM. And I've maintained that relationship as far as cranes. I really love them. I count myself as a card-carrying craniac, which is sort of like a maniac, but it's just centered on cranes. But tonight we're going to be talking about the cranes that occur in Colorado, our Rocky Mountain population. The largest numbers of them are up in the area around Hayden, Steamboat Springs, and Craig. That's where the main nesting population is located. There are some in Mesa County around Colburn. I know there's some in the Spring Creek area, just up by Glenwood Springs and Carbondale, a few very small nesting populations. There's some that nest around Nucla and Naturalist, but by and large, the biggest population is up in the Steamboat, Yampa River Valley, Elk River Valley, and that country up there. And we're going to be talking about the Rocky Mountain population. It's approximately 20,000 birds. They're found in northern Colorado, of course, northeastern Utah, western Wyoming, eastern Idaho, Montana, and a little bit up into southern Saskatchewan and Alberta. They're not near the numbers it is in the mid-continent population. Maybe some of you have been to Kearney, Nebraska and see the birds, the lessers that come through there, and that's almost 600,000 cranes. Ours are the graders. The lessers are a little bit smaller, maybe 25% smaller than the graders, and they have a much larger migration. A lot of the lessers winter down in Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, and but a lot of them end up going up to upper Canada, Alaska, and also some even go into Siberia. So that's what we'll be talking about, is the Rocky Mountain population. One thing I always like to get out of the way, and I think you're a lot of birders here, but I always get the question, well, I just saw down in the creek, I saw a sandhill crane feeding on some fish. And I said, well, no, that's a great blue heron. They kind of look alike, and they got long beaks, they're tall birds, big wing spread, long legs, but of course they're a completely different species than sandhill cranes. And one of the big differences is they nest in trees, heronries, and maybe 15, 25 nests. And so they're a completely different species. Cranes, of course, group up in big flocks during the migration, and great blue herons are sort of solitary species. Sandhill cranes as a whole are one of the oldest living bird species in the world. Fossils in Florida have been found to be about 10 million years old. And then also in northeast Nebraska at Ashfall State Park, they've found a sandhill crane a crowned crane. Looks similar to a sandhill crane, but it's actually the species that occurs in Africa right now, and that's about 10 million years also. There was a big volcano with a lot of ash, and it buried a lot of wildlife species, and the crane did occur. I'm going to talk a little bit in the beginning about the snow mastodon project at Snowmass. It's real close to home here for you folks. In 2010, a bulldozer operator at Ziegler Reservoir, while he was digging the reservoir out to make it a little deeper to hold more water, he found a bone. He got out this bulldozer, and it was either a mastodon or a mammoth bone. And the Denver Museum of Nature and Science started a big paleontological dig there, and found, of course, a huge number of bones. Here's these are courtesy of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Jan Verizen did some paintings, speculation about what Ziegler Reservoir looked like 130,000 years ago. It was a glaciated pond that was glaciated out by a glacier and that went down Snowmass Creek. Later on, about 120,000 years ago, this is what it potentially might have looked like, with mastodons, giant sloths, and the longhorned bison, which is kind of an ancient relative of our current bison. Then about 45,000 years or so ago, there were camels, mammoths, and deer in the area. And I think a lot of people, it was a pretty big project and got a lot of news, and I was always curious of whether maybe there were some crane bones. And so I did call one of the researchers and talked with him, and he kind of laughed at me and he said, "I'm not going to tell you," because he hadn't finished his paper yet and he hadn't gotten it published, so he wasn't going to say anything. Later on, I did contact him, and that's what he found. It's a cervical vertebrae from a crane. It's small. It's bigger than a sandhill crane, but similar in size to a whooping crane. So, and that was estimated between 80,000 and 120,000 years ago. So it was pretty cool to find a crane in our country here that long ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about the biology of cranes, a little bit of their background information. Of course, they're a large bird. One of the main characteristics is the unfeathered forehead that's red in color. They've got a white cheek patch, a black bill, about 48 inches tall. They have a really brightly oranged eye, about greater than a 6-foot wingspan, and they average 10 to 12 pounds. Of course, they nest on the ground. The big difference between them and great blue herons. They fly with an outstretched neck, whereas a great blue heron, we all know, flies with a neck that's curled back. And they have the distinctive bustle. A lot of people think that, well, maybe that's the tail. It kind of looks like a tail. It's pretty distinctive. It's unique to cranes. But where is the bustle? Yeah, you can see there the yellow arrow points to the tail, which is on a crane is actually pretty small. But the tertial feathers, the innermost feathers on the wing, are what makes up the bustle. When they fold their wings back, those inner tertials droop down and form the bustle. So it's a really interesting characteristic of sandhill cranes. Sandhill cranes are long-lived. In the wild, 15 to 25 years is probably a pretty good average. One of the researchers a while back, and actually a long time ago, banded a crane, and it might still be alive. Last I heard, it was about 36 years old, and that's pretty unusual for a wild crane. The males and the females are almost indistinguishable. There is a little bit of difference. Usually the males are a little bit bigger than the females, and a little later on there's one other characteristic that we'll look at that can you distinguish a male from a female. They're omnivores. They'll eat just about anything. Crickets, especially in the spring, there's a lot of crickets in the Steamboat Springs area that come out, but spiders, grain crops that farmers grow, small plants, tubers. One time I saw a crane down by Delta that dug up a plant that had a tuber. It was about 10 feet away from the water, and so it walked all the way down into the water, washed off, looked at it several times, washed it off again, and then finally ate it. So it's kind of like people, they don't like to eat sand too much. So earthworms are real common in their diet. They'll eat mice. I've seen them catch a vole and tear a vole apart to feed to the young. Small snakes, salamanders, just about anything that moves around they'll eat. In the center are pebbles that came from the gizzard. They're just like gallinaceous birds. They eat small pebbles to help in the digestion in the gizzard. Talk a little bit about the coloration of the birds. Their natural color is an ashy, kind of a slate gray on the right. And that's the typical color of sandhill cranes. This is in the winter plumage after the nesting season has been completed. On the bird on the right, one characteristic of sandhill cranes is the feather staining. They'll take iron-laden mud and they'll work it through their feathers. Over a long period of time, as the breeding season is approaching, they're preparing themselves with the coloration. This next slide, it's got some video and some audio. These birds were taken down, video was taken down by Fruit Growers Reservoir down by Eckert, Colorado. And if you watch real close, watch the bird on the left, you'll notice it. I think the next time it goes to the ground, it'll pick up a little bit of grass. And you can kind of see the grass dangling there. And the bird on the right, you can see the mud all over the beak. And I watched these birds for almost 2 hours, and that's what they did for 2 hours. All they're doing is painting their feathers, staining their feathers. It's thought that it's used most likely for camouflage for the birds during the nesting season. Some people say, well, maybe it's getting rid of mites and insects. I don't think that's true. I think it's more likely good for camouflage. This is probably a pair, a male and a female, and they worked on staining their feathers probably for 2 hours or so. That's all they did in the morning. They were waiting to migrate and head north. And there was probably 30 or 40 birds in this group, and that's all they did. Some of the local people that were around watching the birds thought they were just kind of preening or maybe feeding, but they were actually staining their feathers. It's pretty interesting to watch. Talk a little bit about chicks. Chicks, another name they call them colts. These birds are about 70 days old. We, back in the 90s, we did capture some birds and put some radio transmitters on the young birds. We had run them down before they could fly, about a week or so before they could fly. But you can see the difference between that and adult. They've got a dark eye versus the orange eye on an adult. They've got kind of the pinkish bill. Those birds are about 70 days old, almost as big as an adult. No red crown at all, down feathers. They've got kind of a brownish colored hood on top. And the coloration on them is natural coloration of the feathers. That's not any feather staining on their part at this point. Now the colt here is about 160 days old. You can kind of see that the down is kind of falling off from its forehead. It's kind of gray. The eyes aren't quite as yellow as the adult. The beak is starting to turn dark, and it still has that brownish feathered crown. But at this time, they're almost as big as the adults. One thing that's pretty interesting about sandhill cranes is they do a lot of dancing. It's thought to be mainly for pair bonding, but they'll do jumps and bows and twists and turns. They'll pick up sticks and throw them in the air. It gets to be pretty interesting to watch them, and one will bow and the other will jump. And sometimes they'll do it with the neighbors, even though a lot of times it's just pairs that are doing the dancing. The young birds, after they're 6 or 8 months old, they'll join in with the dancing, trying to learn how the dancing goes. And so it's it's a pretty interesting thing to watch. And they'll dance almost year-round, anytime. If you go down to Bosque della Pecci to see cranes down there during the winter, you can see cranes dancing. But it's more common as the nesting season is progressing. This slide here shows what they call the unison call. It's one of the main calls that the birds use. It's also a pair bonding call, but cranes actually have about 12 different calls. They call them bugles, trumpets, rattles, croaks, purrs. A lot of times they purr to get the chicks to come when they found a worm or something for them to eat. And the chicks have kind of I call it a referee's whistle call right after they've hatched. But one of the good characteristics is you'll notice the male's head in the middle is almost straight up, and the female's is cocked maybe to 70-degree angle or something like that. And when they're doing the unison call, the female will usually call twice and the male will call once. But the unison call goes on and on and on, maybe for 30 seconds. It's a long call, but that's one good way to distinguish the male from the female. And I've got a little bit of audio here. Listen for the trill. So that's pretty interesting to hear those chicks, and they'll have that call almost until spring. So they don't get the deeper voice for almost a year. I'm going to talk a little bit about the annual life cycle of sandhill cranes. During the migration, the nesting season, migration farther south, and so we'll kind of look at how their year progresses. I'm going to start off at Monte Vista. It won't be long until the cranes that are down in New Mexico that are wintering along the Rio Grande River, Bosque della Pecci, and some of the other wildlife areas, the cranes will start moving north and they'll fly into Monte Vista National Wildlife Refuge. There's a huge number of cranes that gather there. It's kind of a staging area for the migration farther to the north. And the cranes will start arriving there in February or so, and they'll stay there for a month. Feeding on the grain that the refuge has planted. They plant barley that's donated by the Coors Company. A tremendous amount of grain is planted there. And Monte Vista hosts this annual Sandhill Crane Festival. I'm sure some of you have probably been down to that. It's really interesting, a good place to see cranes. You can get really close, get some good photos and that sort of thing. This is a slide that I took last year down at Monte Vista. It has some audio to it. And the birds were out in the field and feeding until about 10 or 11 o'clock. Then they decided to go to water. It's composed of greater sandhill cranes, lesser sandhill cranes, and a lot of Canada geese, and probably some ducks in there too. And they had been feeding in those barley fields for probably a couple hours, maybe 3 hours, and then they were heading over to an area where there was some water that was available. I'm not sure how many birds were there, probably maybe 10,000 at that time. And this wasn't all, there were birds in other areas too. Some birds are going one way and some birds are coming back. Yeah, right. Well, it's Monte Vista, just south, about 5 miles south of Monte Vista. It's really a great place to go and see a lot of cranes, a lot of other wildlife species there too. And there's the barley fields that Coors donated the grain for to plant. So they stay for about a month or so in Monte Vista. Here's a slide showing some cranes that were roosting on some ice there. But the days are starting to get longer. Things are starting to warm up. People and birds all know that spring's on its way. The breeding season's starting to approach. And there may be up to 20,000 birds there. There's a mixture of mostly graders, our graders, but there are a few lesser sandhill cranes that are part of the mid-continent population. And those birds always separate out. I'm not sure exactly where they go. They probably go over the sand-graded Cristo Mountains and hit the Front Range and then follow the Front Range on up. Because I've never seen a lesser sandhill crane with our Rocky Mountain cranes. It's amazing how they divide themselves out, but they do. So migration, typically on the day when they select, they're going to migrate. Not all the cranes migrate at one time. It's kind of a hopscotch. Different groups of birds go at different dates. Usually starts in early March. They usually like to wait until 9, 10, 11 o'clock in the morning and let things heat up a little bit so they can catch some thermals. They might travel 200 miles in a day. Depending on the weather conditions, maybe 15 to 50 miles an hour. And they typically like to go in clear skies. They don't like to go when the weather's bad. Once they kind of ring up and get maybe a couple thousand feet, they'll line out. And typically they'll fly in a V formation. There's been quite a bit of research done, and it's been shown that the upwash from the leading bird actually helps the trailing bird fly, so it conserves energy for the birds. A lot of times they'll fly up to 14,000 feet as they're going across our Rockies. Quite a few years back in the 90s when we were really studying the cranes pretty intensively, one of our radio banded birds was in Hayden one day. We flew down the next day in the state plane, and I found it. So in one day it had gone from Hayden down to the San Luis Valley. And I was talking to the pilot as we were flying over Gunnison. We were at about 13,000 feet in elevation. I told the pilot, I said, we're kind of like right along the flyway. A couple of minutes later, sure enough, about 10 cranes right out our window, really close. And so we started watching a little more. But flying high is no big deal for them. So the next place they stop after they've left Monte Vista is the town of Orchard City, Eckert. It's a little bit north of Delta, and there's a reservoir there. It's called Fruit Growers Reservoir. You can see somebody really likes crane there. They named one of the lanes Crane Lane. There's a slide showing Fruit Growers Reservoir. They've got a kiosk out there that talks about the cranes. But usually it's a one-day trip from the San Luis Valley to Fruit Growers Reservoir where the birds will stop over, and it's usually a one-night stand there. They'll fly in. They might do a little bit of feeding, but they're all in pretty good body condition. They've had a lot of corn and grain down at Bosque del Apache and other places on the Rio Grande. They've had a lot of good food. The San Luis Valley, so they really don't need a lot of food at this time. So they take a break. If it's a real stormy day, they might spend 2 days there. This slide shows some cranes. They've got livestock in the area. It's mostly surrounded by private land. Back in 2014, Evie Horn, who's a craniac that lives in the area down there, her and some other folks totaled up about over 15,000 cranes that came through. And it's a really good place to see cranes migrating in the spring. They come in and they're maybe 10, 11,000 feet, and they start circling. And a lot of times you'll see them just fix their wings and they'll parachute down thousands of feet. And just as they're reaching the ground, they'll flap a couple times. It's really interesting to watch. You often hear them long before you ever see them. It's a really good place to see cranes. And that's where I saw the cranes that were painting their feathers. So as they return to their nesting grounds or the areas where they are going to nest, a lot of times this was taken up by Steamboat Springs. They'll encounter snow. And things are starting to break up. The temperatures are starting to get warmer. The rivers are kind of opening up a little bit. There's patches of grass that are starting to show. The insects start coming out a lot sooner than you'd think. And the birds are in pretty good condition. And a lot of times they'll go to another little staging areas around the Elk River and also around Hayden. They'll go to some of the old farmers' fields and pick through the grains, and they kind of wait until the conditions are right for nesting. And typically they'll stay in those areas until they start dispersing to the nesting territories. Sandhill cranes don't become sexually mature until about 4 or 5 years old. And so last year's birds, the bachelors and bachelorettes, it's both sexes in the group, kind of group up in small, maybe 20, 25, 30 birds, and they just kind of hang around. They're kind of like teenagers. They have no responsibility, nothing to take care of, no nesting, and so they just kind of cruise around. They learn the countryside. A lot of times the chicks that were hatched, say at Steamboat Springs, they'll come back to the same area. And so they just kind of hang out and enjoy the summer, and spring and the summer. The nesting activity in the lower areas along the Yampa River and the Elk River usually starts in April. In the higher country, it starts about a month later. Elevations here are probably 6,200 feet, something like that. The higher elevations, they'll nest all the way up to 9,000 feet in some of the high parks. And so birds will nest in this lower country and then later on in the higher country. California Park was probably one of the areas where was the last bastion of sandhill cranes when populations were so low. It's kind of a isolated, very, very beautiful high mountain park about 25 miles north of Hayden. It's about 3 miles long and maybe a mile or so wide. It's a rolling sagebrush with a lot of streams, willow-lined streams, great nesting habitat for sandhill cranes. It's part of the National Forest System. So adults pair for life. They first start nesting at about 4 years of age. In the high country up there, they're very territorial and also secretive. Usually maybe 160 acres would be a territory for a sandhill crane pair. And although in some places in the lower country, we do have some larger reservoirs where it seems like maybe 3 or 4 pair might nest. But in the higher country, they're usually pretty secretive, and the nests are really difficult to find. This is really good crane nesting habitat. You can see a beaver dam there. They like to nest in oxbows, and I'll talk just in a few minutes about beaver. But willow and sagebrush, every once in a while they'll nest in the sagebrush, maybe 10 meters or so away from the water, but usually they're within a very short distance of water as they're nesting. This is in California Park also. This is a nest that was constructed in kind of a boggy area. They dug out the sedges and piled them up and made the nest. And so they kind of created a moat for themselves to protect from predation, coyotes and foxes and that sort of thing. This is the same nest in that bog. You can see there's an eggshell that has a little bit of shell membrane on it, which indicates a successfully hatched egg. Typically, if a predator eats an egg, they kind of eat the membrane too. This nest, I think, produced a couple of chicks. This is a little different style. It's made of willow twigs. It was kind of in an oxbow of one of the streams going into California Park. I took the photo when it was a little bit older, but it did have some grasses. Usually they'll have a little bit of a lining on a stick nest like this. So this is evidence of a beaver around, and beaver are really important in Colorado for nesting, especially in the high country. They like to build a nest on a beaver lodge, beaver dam. A lot of the bigger ponds will have hummocks of grass that grow up, and some nests that we've found that they use the same site 20 years or more. So if they're successful and they want to, they know the area, they know where the food's at, and they'll come back to the same nest site. Here's a beaver pond. It's got one of those hummocks of grass. One of our researchers found the nest. It was on that beaver pond, and that's California Park also. So both adults will incubate the eggs, usually the female at night. The male, once daylight hits, the male will trade off, and they usually feed for 2 hours, and then they'll trade off on the incubation. It usually takes about 32 days for the eggs to hatch. They usually start incubating after the first egg is laid, so there might be a delay of a day or so between when one chick is hatched and the other. As a comparison, 2 sandhill crane eggs on the left and chicken egg on the right. They're kind of that light brown with the darker brown spots on them. Usually 2 eggs, sometimes 1, but I have seen 4, which is really unusual to see that many eggs in a nest. Here's another type of nest. It's built with cattails. You can notice they trimmed off all the cattails in the background to make the nest. 2 eggs. You can see how colored up that bird is. She really did, or he, I'm not sure which, really did a good job of sustaining the feathers. This is the same nest. If you look carefully, back at the wing there's a chick. Everybody see that? Yeah. So I suspect there may be an egg that she's still sitting on. That looks like a really freshly hatched chick. And that's actually the same nest site that we saw in the previous slide. A lot of times the chicks can swim from the nest sites. That's no big deal. As soon as they're dried off, they can fly away. Swim away. Here's a chick that's not very old, maybe a day or 2 old. Of course, they're precocial. They're just like a chicken or a duck or a goose. As soon as the down dries out, they're up and going, as opposed to great blue herons where they've got to the chicks have to stay in the nest a long time until they're feathered out and can leave the nest. A lot of times, if it's in an area where there's not a lot of cover, they'll go back and forth from the nest for a couple of weeks. They'll use the nest as a roosting site. Here's an adult with 2 chicks. They're probably maybe 10 days old there. They grow really fast. It's amazing. Better than a half an inch a day. In 70 or 75 days, they're almost as large as the adults. So just an amazing growth rate. Here's a couple of sandhill cranes, each with a chick. A lot of times they'll do that. There is a little sibling rivalry between the chicks sometimes. And so the adults separate them. And the chicks lead on their own. Also, the adults will pick up an earthworm and feed them and that sort of stuff. It doesn't take the chicks too long before they can start figuring out what insects are and that sort of thing and what's good to eat. You can see a sandhill crane sort of in the center right there. And the right-hand side, that's the rear view mirror of my pickup truck. So I was pretty close. I didn't want to get out. I'm sure there was a chick right around there somewhere. I never did see it. I didn't spend a lot of time there. But a lot of times aspen is good rearing habitat. The stream here was located about 100 yards away from this aspen patch, but there's really good forage, a lot of insects, a lot of grasses and tubers and that sort of stuff. Really good feed in the aspen. It's also a pretty good cover if a coyote comes loping along or something. It's good cover for the chicks to hide in. So what happens in August in Colorado? The temperatures start getting cooler, the aspen starts to change, winter's on its way. Colder temperatures, all the bugs are starting to die, earthworms are going deeper in the ground, it's harder to find food. So the birds all know, like the people, know it's about time to migrate. And they start migrating in the Steamboat Springs, Hayden area, also around Meeker, there's quite a few cranes. They'll move down to the same staging areas they used in the spring. And it's not all one big group. It usually depends on when the chicks were hatched. The chicks and the female and the male adults were in areas where they weren't seeing any other. They might hear other cranes, but they come down, the 4 of them or 3 of them, depending on how many chicks there were, and they come down to the staging areas, and there might be 500 cranes. So it's probably a really big surprise for the young chicks to see all these cranes. And actually, a lot of times as they do come down, the ones that first come down kind of stay on the periphery. The adults kind of let them integrate into the larger flocks. And that usually begins mid-August, early September is when the migration to the lower country starts. There's an adult on the top, an adult on the bottom, and a chick in the middle. So you can see they're almost the same size. So they fly down to the staging areas there at Hayden and the Elk River. Most of the staging areas are within a mile or two of the river. And they feed in grain fields, usually wheat fields in the Steamboat Springs and the Hayden area. One thing that's occurring up there, there's not nearly as much agriculture as it used to be. It used to be about 8,500 acres. 85,000 acres of wheat up in that country, and now it's down to about 10. And the bird habits are changing a little bit because landowners change what they're growing, but they still gather up in flocks for feeding. The cranes all roost in water. That's pretty typical. Every night in the evening as they fly in from the feeding, they'll fly into the river. They like to roost in maybe 12 to 16 inches of water. It's very good protection from predators. They nest, they group up in a large group. It's not a bird here and a bird there and spread out. They're all kind of in a large group. It's a really good way to protect themselves from predators. If a coyote tries to, or a bobcat tries to get them in the water, they can fly away. In a good year, about 8% of the population is composed of chicks. If it's down to about 4%, you'd know that the population didn't have a very good nesting season. And also cranes from other states, Wyoming, Montana, also come down, hopscotch down, and use our staging areas. You can see an adult on the left there and a chick on the right. Oh, let me go back a second. You can see that the adult is already starting to molt its feathers. It's starting to lose those stained feathers, and it's starting to be replaced by the natural gray feathers. So the migration from the Yampa River Valley down to the San Luis Valley usually occurs in the latter part of September. And that's kind of a hopscotch too. It's not one big migration. Different groups of birds will go on different days, and I'm not sure exactly what keys that, but they'll migrate down to the San Luis Valley. Then the sandhill cranes will arrive in the San Luis Valley in September, October, and November, and they'll stay down there and feed in the grain fields. That's Mount Blanca in the background, and this is down at the Monte Vista National Wildlife Refuge. They've just grown all the barley and the wheat down there, mostly barley, and they'll stay there for quite some time before they migrate on down to the mid and lower Rio Grande River. Bosque del Apache is one of the main areas. They plant a lot of grain in that area. This is a slide of Bosque del Apache, one of the ponds they have there. They plant a lot of corn, other grain crops that they utilize. A lot of times they'll go through and knock down the corn so the cranes have easy access to it. There's a couple of sandhills that are kind of parachuting. They got their heads up and the legs down. They're getting ready to land in the water. So they spend December, January, and February down at Bosque del Apache feeding in. I'm not sure exactly what kind of grain crop that is there, but it's a flooded area. And they move back and forth, and at times there could be up to 15,000 cranes down there. A lot of times there's up to 60,000 snow geese at Bosque del Apache. If you ever get a chance to go down, it's really a great place. They have a lot of road systems, and it's a good place to photograph sandhill crane. So then after that, a week or not too much longer from now, they're going to go back to the San Luis Valley. It's kind of where we started on this annual cycle of the cranes. One thing I do want to talk about is this is kind of a change in the habits of sandhill cranes. We now have wintering sandhill cranes down by Delta. There's the Escalante State Wildlife Area. These cranes used to always go down to the San Luis Valley and then on farther down into New Mexico, but their habits have changed. Escalante State Wildlife Area is a good place for roost sites. It's got a lot of meanders and oxbows and places where there's good roosting habitat. the farmers surrounding that area grow a lot of corn, so it's perfect habitat for the cranes. And this has kind of been occurring over maybe a 20-year period. There were really small numbers, but in the last 5 or 6, 7, 8 years, the numbers have really climbed, and it's up to almost 3,000, 3,500 cranes that are. So it's getting to be a pretty large chunk of the 20,000 cranes that used to migrate farther south that stay here and feed in the cornfields. I talked to one of the biologists up at Ouray National Wildlife Refuge up south of Vernal. In the last 2 years, they've had almost 2,000 sandhills wintering there, and the lady said that was the first time ever that they've had wintering sandhill cranes up there. So that's almost 5,000 cranes out of the 20,000 that aren't going farther south. I guess anybody could have a conjecture, but I kind of think it's maybe the winters are getting milder, and the corn's available, and they're probably like people, they're a little bit lazy. If you don't have to fly that far south and you can get your belly full every evening with corn or whatever, then why do it? But that area around Escalante is a really good place now to go down and watch for cranes. I went down a couple of days ago and saw a lot of cranes. It's a good place to go down in the evening and watch them as they go into some of the roost sites. I'm going to talk just real quick about what happened to the cranes. Why did they become endangered in Colorado? We had to put them on the state endangered species list. There were probably 3 different aspects. One was market hunting. It's kind of like the bison. You've probably seen photos of the big stacks of bison skulls, and they were shooting all the bison on the plains, a lot of times just for the hides. Everybody wanted a bison hide. And did the same thing with birds. A lot of birds populations were really reduced. And a lot of it was for sale in markets. In 1895, about 385 sandhills were sold in San Francisco for about 50 cents each. Also in California, a lot of before they started raising turkeys, the hunters would go out and shoot sandhill cranes, and for Christmas dinner they were eating sandhill cranes rather than turkeys. So that was probably a big reason for the loss of sandhill cranes. Here's just another slide showing a whooping crane and several sandhill cranes that were shot. So that was probably one impact on the cranes. Another was the unregulated grazing. At the turn of the century and before, people brought livestock out, and it was open range. Wherever you could graze your cattle, it was fine. And they did, large numbers. An old Forest Service guy up in Steamboat Springs told me that his granddad was riding from Steamboat up to California Park. And as he rode over the top of the hill and was just about be able to view California Park, he saw this smoke and he thought California Park was on fire. As it turned out, once he got a little better view, there was about 20,000 head of livestock in California Park, and that was just dust. All the vegetation was gone. The ranchers were gathering all the livestock up to ship them down to Steamboat to the railroad. And so that had a huge impact on beaver dams, all the willows and all the vegetation. So that really impacted the habitat. And then beaver were another issue. Back in the 1800s, beaver were trapped almost to extinction. I've read some reports about the Hudson Bay Company. In 1 year, 200,000 beaver skins were shipped to Europe. And so that occurred in the continental United States also. And that was the one reason. It really made good beaver felt hats, and that was the big rage up until about 1850 when it changed, and that kind of went out of style. But so the combination of hunting, overhunting, beaver trapping, as I think I indicated earlier, maybe I forgot, but in Colorado, approximately 60% of the beaver nests are associated with beaver ponds, lodges, and that sort of thing. So a huge number of beaver were lost. And of course the overgrazing was really a big impact too. I'm on the board of the Yampa Valley Crane Festival, which takes place in Steamboat Springs. This coming year it'll be August 29th to September 1st. They have a lot of opportunities for some viewing of cranes in some of the staging areas, and they have a lot of good speakers. Last year they had Jennifer Ackerman there. She Genius of Birds. She wrote a book, and they have good speakers. Several years ago they had a speaker from Mongolia, so it's a really interesting couple of days watching cranes and learning about cranes. They have Hawk Watch comes and brings some raptors down for viewing and that sort of thing. Kind of like to conclude, this is a quote from Aldo Leopold in the Marshland Elegy. That's really a good, I'm sure a lot of you have probably read that, Sand County Almanac. It just talks about how he feels about cranes, and that's it's the way I feel about it, and I'm sure a lot of you feel about cranes that way also. Well, that pretty much concludes my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
So Van, I'll let you call on people, and then I'll come around with a mic. Please wait for the mic to come to you. Hold it right about here, and that's for our TV audiences.
What do you know about the origins of the name Sandhill Crane?
I've actually researched and I haven't found the answer yet. Some people say it's from the sandhills of Nebraska. I don't think that's true. It was a naturalist, I forget his first name, William Bartram, I think, down in Florida. They called them Savannah cranes. And there's places down in Florida, I was actually born in Florida, and there's some sandhills, Turkey oak, sandhill, sand pine, and that actually stretches up into Georgia. I've kind of researched it to the point where just before, well, actually when Lewis and Clark, 1804, 1805, started heading west, I've read through their notes, and initially they call it a brown crane, and then all of a sudden at some point in time they start calling it the sandhill crane. And it seems a little odd that Lewis and Clark would name the crane a sandhill crane. But that's a really good answer, and so far I've talked to people at the International Crane Foundation, and they haven't figured it out either. But it'd be nice to know exactly where that came from. That's a good question.
Didn't mean to stump the band on that.
So in Monte Vista, are they deliberately growing grain? Humans are growing grain?
Yes.
And down in Bosque on the border, they're deliberately growing grain?
Right.
And then up in the Yampa Valley, are they deliberately growing grain, or is the farmers are inadvertently feeding the cranes, and how do they feel about it?
It at one time, well, and it still is. They're kind of, the cranes are taking advantage. And a long time ago, when I worked up in the Steamboat Springs area, there were some concerns. Some of the farmers thought they didn't worry so much about the grain they were actually eating, but they thought that as they landed and took off from the fields, that they were knocking a lot of grain down. And in some places there might have been up to 1,000 cranes in the fields. The way the farming practices have changed is you don't hear too many issues about that anymore. The amount of grain is a lot less, and actually some of the good things from the advent of the Yampa Valley Crane Festival, we're actually got a project going. It's called Crops for Cranes. So we're actually paying some of the farmers to leave a little bit of the grain for the cranes, and the festival actually around town has generated a lot of positive things about the cranes, and some of the ranchers that at one time might not have liked the crane so much, they've kind of changed their tune because all their neighbors are got to the point where they kind of like to see the cranes around. So it's not as much of an issue it has been, and some of the farmers are actually benefiting from the planting of the cranes and the festival actually paying for that.
So why has the acreage of grain being grown for human consumption dropped so dramatically? You said from 80 to 10,000 acres?
Yeah, it's just economics. There's so much grain being produced that in the Conservation Reserve Program, where the government actually pays the farmers not to grow grain, they plant it into grasses, native grasses hopefully in most cases, and it's just a market issue.
Is the high elevation migration strictly a virtue of having to clear the 14,000 foot mountains, or is there any other reason for that height, that altitude?
No, well, I think they normally do, but usually it seems like they're about 1,000 or 2,000, maybe 3,000 feet. A lot of times you'll hear them before you ever see them, but most of it, I think I failed to mention, a lot of the cranes that are nesting in our country fly straight from the San Luis Valley, just right in almost a straight line up to Steamboat Springs in Hayden, where a lot of those birds that I was talking about down at Eckert Reservoir, they actually fly to the northwest. They fly right over the edge of Grand Mesa. They fly right over Grand Junction, and their next stop is usually along the Green River at Vernal. That's another resting place. And then they disperse from there up into northeast Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana. And but yeah, our birds that come up into our country, they're going over 13,000 foot peaks. So it's just a matter of clearing the elevations at that point.
Yeah, I'm going to have to argue with you on that. My cabin's up on Aspen Mountain at 10,000 feet, and I'll hear them going by. Have to find a pair of binoculars to chase them down in the sky overhead in the fall as they're coming down. And I think they're actually catching good winds, tailwinds, but they're at least 10,000 feet. It's like 2 miles above my cabin at 10,000 feet. So, I mean, my question is, like, what's the maximum height we've ever seen them at? I know we've seen, I think it's the Nene goose over the Himalayas at 30,000 feet type of a thing. So
yes, well, some of the cranes over there, I can't remember what species, do fly over the Himalayas too. So they're at 29. So you're saying that you're at 10,000 feet and they're 10,000 feet above that?
At least.
Yeah. Well, that's possible. I've never seen them that high. I've been up on Grand Mesa and seen them at places that are almost 12,000, and they're probably a couple thousand feet above that. And like the time at the airplane, we were flying at probably, I can't remember exactly, 12, 13, or 14,000 feet. So I'm sure they can fly a lot higher if they have to. And maybe you're right. They've caught a good thermal, and they like to glide and use as little as energy as possible. So that's a good point.
Well, they look like they were on a straight beeline for the going into the San Luis there, into the Monte Vista.
Yeah.
And usually October when they come overhead, and it's like this quote says, when you hear his call, I mean, I find myself, like, I'll drop everything I'm doing and look for him.
That's good. That's interesting information. Thanks.
I wonder if you would talk a little bit about mortality and what some of the common threats are and predators.
Yeah, it's like most species. The chicks probably have the greatest mortality. The ravens, coyotes, foxes, eagles will take birds. Weasels will take, especially when the chicks are really small. Just about any kind of raccoons, maybe badgers or something like that. Colorado doesn't hunt sandhill cranes. In 2012, they tried to get a season going on up around Steamboat Springs, and a bunch of the people that actually organized the Yampa Valley Crane Festival got a petition going, and there was a lot of testimony, and there might have been enough local cranes for a hunting season, but I used to work for Division of Wildlife, and I actually wrote a letter and said I didn't think it was a good idea. There might be good, population might be good enough for a limited harvest, but they hadn't done a very good job with public relations. And but all the surrounding states do. Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, down in New Mexico, they all hunt. So that's, but it's real limited. It's probably not a huge amount. Wire strikes, especially down at San Luis Valley, they've got a lot of the power lines have markers on them, little different things to try to make them more visible. And also down at Bosque del Apache, they've kind of tried to do that too. I was down at Monte Vista one time and saw a bald eagle fly in and kill a sandhill crane. And when they were doing the cross whooping crane program up in Idaho, and that was back in the 80s, where they were putting whooping crane eggs in sandhill nests. They had one over by Price, Utah. A golden eagle knocked one of the hoopers out of the air, one of the chicks. They used a ultralight to guide the whooping cranes down. And that one, the hooper actually didn't die. They picked it up and they rehabilitated it. So there's a lot of predators out there that will take sand. But once they reach the adult age, wire strikes, and every once in a while they've had a few problems with, I think, avian cholera down at Bosque del Apache, because they get so many cranes, 60 or 70,000 snow geese, and I don't know how many ducks and other waterfowl down there that they maybe have lost a few that way. But once they get to be adults, they're pretty indestructible.
Can you tell us how long do you think the colts stay with their parents?
They'll stay with them all the way. They'll probably follow them back after winter, so they're almost a year old, maybe not quite a year old. But once the adults start to build nests and that sort of stuff, they'll run them off. And so once they're incubating, the chicks are off on their own in those bachelor groups and that sort of thing. But they'll stay with them all. And it's amazing sometimes to see them in those huge flocks, like the video I showed you, how a chick stays with it's amazing. I don't know how they do it. Yeah. One guy was telling me that I think he was down at Bosque, and a huge number, and there was one chick that was whistling like a referee's whistle, and another bird called somewhere, but it went right down and flew right down, and he assumed it was the adults, so they could tell. So it's amazing what wildlife does. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Van. And just a reminder to join us at Aspen Tap. Come see me if you'd like a stamp. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Van.
All right.
Really appreciate it.